Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Description of Acquaintance, The Letters of Laura Riding and Gertrude Stein, 1927 to 1930. Edited by Logan Esdale and Jane Malcolm. Narrated by Elizabeth Wiley. Introduction. This book tells the story of Laura Riding and Gertrude Stein through their letters to each other. For 3 years, from 1927 to 1930, their literary friendship was sustained through correspondence. They met just twice, as they lived in cities, London and Paris, and villages, Deya and Birignan. They were both Americans who left for Europe in their mid to late 20s, but Stein was a generation older than Riding. They were women living unconventional lives, and they were writers whose texts challenged the reader's ordinary mode of meaning-making. Both were central modernist figures when they knew each other. After their personal relationship ended, they kept the letters and eventually placed them in university archives. Now, for the first time, the extant letters have been gathered, ordered, and annotated. They tell the story of the work of writing and publishing, of Riding's personal turmoil and her coming through it, with Stein as a much-needed interlocutor, of Stein's quite sudden silence and Riding's hurt. But this edition is also about the letters themselves, their material history, and the particular narrative created through epistolary contingencies and delays. Most of the letters are undated, and while we have almost all of them, there are missing letters, enclosures, and contexts. They were writing to each other, after all, not for us. While ordering and annotating does create a narrative and brings clarity to our understanding of Riding and Stein's relationship, this is not the smooth narrative of biography. No amount of annotation will tell the whole story. The uneasy thrill of studying other people's letters comes not only from having access to private documents, but also from their incompleteness. Both the gaps and the annotations invite us to interpret creatively, to imagine a story from what we have provided here. The narrative of this book can be interpreted as a romance, one-sided perhaps, as Riding's emotional investment outweighs Stein's. Hearing their letters is like listening to a novel about two people who have so much in common but are incompatible. Love and loyalty and a sense of possibility defer the end, but eventually the end comes. Framing the letters is a scholarly apparatus, and even if it gets in the way, the contextualizing materials make this a mediated perspective on the letters. It is necessary. We want to promote informed readings of texts that often demand speculation. But the main story is in the words of these two writers, what they say to each other and how they say it. Stein and Riding were surrounded by men equally as ambitious for recognition, and in a world made for men, they could look to each other in the spirit of solidarity as Jewish American women who wrote difficult texts and asserted their voices. They avoided, however, an assumed solidarity, knowing the uncertainty that writers feel in the time between letters, waiting for a connection and a reply. The Riding-Stein letters are the focus of this volume, but there are, of course, other figures around them. Of the 93 letters in this collection, 46 are from Riding and 32 are from Stein. 15 are from Robert Graves, Riding's writing and life partner at the time. From the beginning, these letters involved Graves. He and Riding ran Season Press, which would publish Stein's An Acquaintance with Description in April 1929. For the first year and a half of this correspondence, there were updates on the publishing process, so a letter from Riding usually implied Graves's presence, and for a few months in 1929, he writes as a proxy for Riding. Riding is the primary correspondent, but Graves's role must be acknowledged, and his letters included. Another secondary figure is artist Len Lye, a close friend of Riding's and Graves's, whose work was gifted to Stein. Lye's 4 letters to Stein will be found in the notes. Background figures include poet Hart Crane as an amative force, and composer Virgil Thomson as a divisive one. Friendships with others nurtured and complicated the Stein-Riding relationship. A Description of Acquaintance is for scholars of modernism and of early Riding and mid-career Stein. It is also for poets and general audiences interested in topics such as the epistolary genre, Americans abroad, self-publishing, mental health, and women writers in the 1920s. It offers access to the private history of collaboration and exchange between these 2 influential writers, and the affective and intellectual bond between them. It invites us to study the 2 writers together. Before. When the correspondence began in 1927, Stein was 53 years old and had published 5 important books: 3 Lives, 1909, Tender Buttons, 1914, Geography and Plays, 1922, The Making of Americans, 1925, and Composition as Explanation, 1926. All received significant attention from reviewers, who were either confused and dismissive, or enthusiastic and ready to champion her as a paradigmatic radical. Stein, 1874 to 1946, and Alice Toklas, 1877 to 1967, met in 1907 and had lived together for 17 years. The 2 women, both Americans from the San Francisco Bay Area, had held a Saturday salon before World War I at their Paris apartment, 27 Rue de Fleurus, where Stein had lived since 1903, and in the 1920s they were legendary figures for visiting Brits and Americans to meet. On the apartment's walls was her collection of modernist paintings by Paul Cézanne, Pablo Picasso, and many others, and it was a place to find out the latest. Old friends were not necessarily forgotten, but Stein's visitors were often young, from the new generation. She was generally accessible and affable, while projecting a seriousness about her work. She had her creative principles, and liked meeting people who were likewise developing their own, and were sustaining the modernist infrastructure, presses, magazines, etc. Riding had moved from America to England a year earlier, in 1926. From a correspondence she had had with the English poet Robert Graves in 1925, she decided to join him and his wife, Nancy Nicholson. Riding, 1901 to 91, had married and was recently divorced, and when she arrived in London, she had unpublished manuscripts and was looking forward to collaborating with Graves, 1895 to 1985, who was already established as a writer. She quickly published 2 books of poetry, The Close Chaplet, 1926, and Voltaire, a Biographical Fantasy, 1927, a French-to-English translation, 1926, of Marcel Le Goff's Anatole France at Home, 1924, and a Survey of Modernist Poetry, 1927, a critical book. The last in that list was co-written with Graves, who had gravitated to Riding emotionally and drifted from his role as husband and father to his 4 children with Nicholson. Riding's parents, like Stein's, had a background as Jewish immigrants from Europe, and also like Stein, Riding was university educated. She had gone to Cornell, 1918 to 20, while Stein had attended Harvard, 1893 to 1897, and Johns Hopkins, 1897 to 1902. Riding grew up in New York City. When the correspondence with Stein began, she was young, 26 years old, but felt herself to be a person of experience and stature. By 1927, Stein had published only a fraction of what she had written, so she was looking for adventurous publishers who would take her on. The emergence of Season Press in the summer of that year was thus welcome news, and Stein was apparently the first person whom Riding and Graves contacted for a manuscript. It was this request that initiated the correspondence and kept it going until April 1929, when Stein's An Acquaintance with Description was published. But before we describe in more detail the context for Riding and Stein being in correspondence, we need to back up to 1926 and amplify what's already been said. That year was a turning point, as coincidentally, both writers established or secured an audience in England. After Riding arrived in England at the beginning of 1926 and joined Graves and Nicholson, she immediately went with them to Cairo, Egypt, where Graves took a lucrative teaching position. They returned to England in June, and by the end of that summer she and Graves shared an apartment in London. Nicholson and the children were in Islip, a village just north of Oxford. From September to December 1926, Riding and Graves lived in Vienna, Austria, working primarily on a survey of modernist poetry. Leonard and Virginia Woolf had accepted The Close Chaplet for their Hogarth press, and it was published in October 1926. To that point, Riding had published more than 40 poems in magazines, many in The Fugitive out of Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Poets associated with that magazine, such as Alan Tate and John Crow Ransom, had promoted Riding, but The Close Chaplet generated a new level of attention. Despite an unflattering review in the Monthly Criterion that compared her writing to Stein's, Riding's move to England, an impulsive one, was working out. Indeed, to be misunderstood by the British literary establishment, to be compared to Stein, was arguably a point of pride. When Riding, Graves, and Nicholson returned to Islip in June 1926, they just missed the opportunity to hear and meet Stein, who had lectured at Oxford on 7 June, and at Cambridge on 4 June. They did not attend, but Graves was an Oxford graduate and was well connected with the circle of people around such an event. In London on 1 June, for instance, at a welcome party for Stein hosted by Edith Sitwell was Siegfried Sassoon, a close friend of Graves. Also at the party was Virginia Woolf, who wrote in her diary that Stein was rather formidable. As they reached Islip and settled themselves after 5 months of travel and Cairo life, stories about Stein's visit to England must have been in the air. It is unclear when Riding first read Stein or what she read. Whatever her familiarity at that point, this example of an American woman, a modernist, holding center stage in England must have been energizing. Sitwell had organized the lectures and was a self-elected champion of Stein in England prior to Riding's taking a similar role. Indeed, Stein had many supporters, many of whom were women. Mabel Dodge Luhan, Carl van Vechten, Sherwood Anderson, Ernest Hemingway, Jane Heap, Marianne Moore, and Breyer had helped with publishing, and Moore and Mina Loy had recently praised her writing. On the other hand, as her friend Henry McBride warned her in 1920, there is a public for you, but no publisher. That is to say, as interesting as her work could be to other writers, it would not be a commercial success. Until The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, 1933, a bestseller, Stein would largely rely on small presses and magazines, on her personal connections with other writers. This visit to England was an opportunity to promote herself in public, in her own words, and with her own presence. The latter aspect was discomfiting. As a woman, she was sure to be admired less for her work than for her personality. Stein wavered on accepting Sitwell's invitation, and then took the risk and wrote an essay that falls into two parts, the first on modernism, the second on her own work, which exemplifies the modern impulse. Originally titled An Address, the lecture concluded with 4 examples of her writing: a poem, Preciosia, 1913, a play, A Saint in Seven, 1922, and 2 portraits, Sitwell Edith Sitwell, 1925, and Jean Cocteau, 1925-26. When Hogarth Press accepted the lecture for publication, Stein changed the title to Composition as Explanation, and included the 4 other pieces. It came out a month after The Close Chaplet, in November 1926, and it got Riding's attention. In early 1927, Riding wrote an essay defending Stein and placing her at the center of the modernist story. She had in mind a review of Composition as Explanation by T.S. Eliot. There is something precisely ominous about Miss Stein. Her books of about 1,000 pages may and will remain unread. But Miss Stein is going to make trouble for us just the same. In this Hogarth essay of 59 pages, the atom is dissociated. Her work is not improving, it is not amusing, it is not interesting, it is not good for one's mind. But its rhythms have a peculiar hypnotic power not met with before. It has a kinship with the saxophone. If this is the future, then the future is, as it very likely is, of the barbarians. But this is a future in which we ought not to be interested. At stake was influence. If people liked Stein, they might write like her, with an improvisatory style and abandonment of literary referentiality, a future that Eliot claimed was alarming. Modernism would be defined in part by alliances, and Riding made her choice. Her essay, The New Barbarism and Gertrude Stein, was published in the 3rd issue of Transition magazine in June 1927. Co-edited by Eugene Jolas and Elliot Paul, both Americans in Paris, Transition launched in April 1927 and ended in 1938. It stood in opposition to magazines such as Eliot's Criterion, or at the least it was an alternative. Paul especially wanted to ally the magazine with Stein, and her work appeared regularly in 11 of the first 16 issues, April 1927 to June 1929. They brought Tender Buttons back into print in the fall 1928 issue, number 14, and in February 1929, number 15, included a bibliography of her writing from 1904 to 1929, listing chronologically by year not just publications, but most everything she had written. The full scope of her career was hardly yet known. Riding was also a regular in Transition, having work in 8 of the first 14 issues, and the two women appeared together 6 times, numbers 3, 6, 10, 12 through 14. On the contents page of the magazine's first issue was a list of contributors to the forthcoming second issue in May 1927, and among the names was Riding's. Although her essay did not appear until the third issue, it is evidence that Transition had it lined up by early spring. Paul was likely the editor who accepted it, as he alludes to Riding in an article on Stein for the Paris edition of the Chicago Tribune, otherwise known as the Paris Tribune, on 17 June 1927. Referring to Stein's 1926 Hogarth book, he writes, "Hasty people are often misled by a title. Mr. Edmund Wilson, the anonymous clerk on the Dial, who deigned to notice the book at all, and all other American reviewers decided erroneously that composition as explanation was merely an attempt on Miss Stein's part to explain her own work. Nothing could be farther from the point. She uses her own work and development incidentally as illustrations, but the book is an exposition of certain fundamentals of aesthetics which needed badly to be stated. What she says would apply to Nathaniel Hawthorne or Li Po. It was left for Miss Laura Riding, American poet residing in England, to discover this and to appreciate it." Indeed, Riding was an early and enthusiastic defender of Stein's radical poetics. Her audacious essay for Transition reclaims the pejorative and racist term barbarism from Eliot's disparaging review. Riding also critiques what she views as modernism's misplaced devotion to criticism, which assumes all the prerogatives which belong to creation without assuming any of its concrete responsibilities. She faults Eliot especially, calling him an autocrat for authority, for writing always with the profession of poetry and not direct communication in mind. She argues that his version of modernism, Ezra Pound and James Joyce are mentioned too, merely produces earnest caricatures of ordinary language, unlike Stein, who is divinely inspired in ordinariness. Stein's work, she argues, uses words that are no older than her use of them, to create a human mean in language. It is a modernist practice that rejects sophistication and haughty coyness for the literal and the naive. Stein's work, especially her emphasis on composition, thus embodies a truly avant-garde poetic mode. The criticism is talking backwards. The composition, because its time is a continuous present, is talking forwards. Riding's stance on Stein was and remains a major paradigm in the context of modernist studies. Her insights locate Stein's work at the beginning of a long genealogy of language-based experimental poetry that extends into the present. Along with writing on Stein, publishing her would likewise promote a modernism divinely inspired in ordinariness. Much later, in 1983, Ulla Dido wrote to Riding Jackson to learn more about how Season Press came to publish An Acquaintance with Description. There is an undated letter to Gertrude Stein from Eliot Paul, who says, "Laura Riding wants to publish something of yours. Is this what happened? And is this the beginning of that publication?" Although Riding Jackson does not answer Dido's question, we can try. In May 1927, Riding and Graves moved into an apartment at 34A St. Peter's Square, Hammersmith, London, where they would live until September 1929. In June 1927, Riding and Paul published their essays on Stein, and Graves started Lawrence and the Arabs, receiving a large advance. With that money, he and Riding started Season Press, and Riding wrote to Paul that she wanted to publish something of Stein's. Paul knew Stein and passed on the message. Then the correspondence between Riding and Stein began. The letters. The letters begin in November 1927, with Riding acknowledging receipt of the manuscript of Stein's An Acquaintance with Description, and the publication process is one thread for audiences to follow. Through late summer 1928 and into the winter, they handle page proofs for the book. Stein signs labels that will be pasted onto the frontispiece, and in January 1929, Riding reports that the book is nearly done. Also at that time, she sends Stein a sample of the binding. Finally, in April 1929, Stein receives the book, and Graves will discuss with her where to send review copies. The business of publishing continues in 1930, from Riding's assuring Stein in January that we are going to send you a check sometime in settlement of acquaintance, to Stein's saying in June that her royalty had arrived. Stein stops writing to Riding shortly after that. With the thread all laid out, publishing the book began and clearly fueled the correspondence. And perhaps once it was done, Stein felt she could drop the connection. As essential as it was to their relationship, and as important as it is to recognize the work of small press publishing, the Season Press thread ultimately is not what compels our attention. It was a structural support for the correspondence, but not the heart of it. What started for Riding as an interest in Stein's writing became immensely personal. Following that narrative, the move from seeing Stein as an author she admired to needing her as a palliative presence, the move from Dear Miss Stein to Thinking to Gertrude, tell her, has kept me alive in the worst hours, is what we will focus on in this section. The correspondence has a slow start, with just 7 extant letters in the first 9 months. After a brief exchange in November 1927, they do not write again for 5 months. In her next letter, Riding is in Paris with Graves, and she would like to meet Stein. Before this May 1928 visit, she drops off a copy of her latest book, Anarchism is Not Enough, and tags a couple of chapters for Stein to read. This may not have been a welcome conversation starter for Stein, and Riding's next step was certainly a miscalculation. Reacting to being referred to as Mrs. Graves in a newspaper article, taking it personally as an attack on her, she blamed Virgil Thomson and asked Stein to destroy him. The visit, a positive experience for both, had led Riding to believe that Stein would take her side. Stein replies in no uncertain terms, "I don't like controversy, and I like to mind my own business." Riding, though, is unwilling to sidestep controversy, particularly when there is a point at which these things become physical to me. Nor can she look past Stein's frank reply. "It makes me very sad," Riding says, "that you should have felt it necessary to write to me in this way." After a cooling-off period of a couple of months, the letters resume, and both seem to recognize their temperamental differences. Riding acknowledges Stein's congenial nature. "Pleasure, of course, is a feeling for other people, and it seems very natural to me that you should say this about transition, because you are kind. I should never have thought of saying it myself." While Stein will accept Riding's intensity, in a letter to Graves, she will observe that Laura is so poignant and so uptight. In fall 1928, the correspondence matures and becomes more personal. Season business is one aspect, and there is also a book exchange. Stein sends useful knowledge, and Riding reciprocates with her book of poems, Love as Love, Death as Death.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?